Thank you, Chairman. Good morning. I'd like to focus a bit on the benefit-cost ratio. And first of all, Dr. Wellings, there is talk of the DfT's own rules are that you shouldn't include the wider economic benefit in calculating a benefit-cost ratio. But obviously, it shows a significantly lower BCR if you don't include the wider economic impact. Have you done any work on that yourself? And can you tell us whether excluding wider economic benefits is essential or just a matter of choice in this project?
Well, I think the looking at the standard literature on this, the wider economic benefits are generally fairly low. I prefer not to include them because they're so questionable and nebulous, and they also have to be set against wider economic losses. So you've got something called deadweight losses. It goes beyond the direct cost of the tax bill. It's this sort of extra cost to society due to the economic activity that's suppressed by the tax bill. And it's typically, it varies depending on how the tax is raised. It varies enormously. It's relatively low for things like VAT, relatively high for things like fuel duty. It's potentially extremely high if something's funded with government borrowing under certain circumstances where the government's already got high debts, etc. So I think usually, as a rule of thumb, the wider economic benefits are usually more than exceeded by these wider economic costs from the deadweight losses. So I think.
And has any work been done by the DfT or by you yourself in terms of assessing the wider economic costs?
Well, I mean, it's very difficult to do because you don't actually have the knowledge to do that, because can't really tell what the marginal pound in tax is going to be raised or borrowing. So you just have to make this assumption, and that's part of what the Treasury's job is, to factor that into the equation. That's why they usually demand a much higher BCR than 1 before a project goes ahead. And assuming that the BCR is also, people behind the project are probably exaggerating the BCR. I mean, that's probably one of the reasons why you want a very high number before going ahead, even before you get into the whole opportunity cost argument. So it's your view, just to be very clear, it's your view that the wider economic benefits should be excluded from the BCR. That would be the right way to do this. I think that's right. I mean, I don't think that's a. I think the webs are generally derivative of the other elements of the standard elements of the BCR anyway. So in terms of deciding between projects, I think I don't think it makes an enormous difference to exclude them. But I think, given that they're so nebulous and difficult to calculate, I mean, going back to the KPMG reports, I mean, personally, I think it's highly questionable that you can make reliable forecasts of 24 years in advance, given political risks, disruptive technologies, etc., etc. So,
but that doesn't really answer it, does it, Mr. Dr. Wellings? Because you've got to do something. That would say, well, because you can't forecast something, we better not do anything where the returns don't come in for a quarter of a century. So it is difficult, but we have to acknowledge that they've got a challenge on their hands.
No, but the point
We're asking whether they've made the best effort.
But you're deciding between different projects anyway. It's an opportunity cost argument, so I don't think that's the answer. So.
Okay. So, Professor Overman, the fact that this BCR has gone down in this latest report, should we take that as sinister or just kind of all swivelling out in the wash? Does it matter that it's gone down?
Well, actually, I take a slightly different view to Dr. Wellings. I think the BCR and the BCR with wider economic benefits are two important pieces of information that we should take into account when trying to make a decision about £50 billion worth of expenditure, because otherwise we're guessing. I mean, otherwise we have no mechanism for thinking about how to spend our scarce resources. So I would make the following distinction, though, that in the DfT's own guidance, at least the version of it that I accessed last week, which is called the web tag guidance, they suggest that BCRs should be presented without the wider economic benefits. Now, my reading of that is that they should be presented without the wider economic benefits for the purpose of the value for money comparisons that DfT make when they're calling something very poor, medium, etc. So, my view on that is that you should take the 1.8 BCR that comes out of that and, using DfT's own guidance, say that's a medium value project. Now, I have to say that, I went back and looked what it takes to be a medium value project, in the sort of distribution of all the BCRs we have out there for transport projects, and it appears that, you know, medium value you can get in if you're sort of in the bottom 25%. So I'm not sure that medium is the sort of standard way in which we'd use that word, but I think the 1.8 is informative. Then I think that you add the wider economic benefits onto that and report them as a separate component, because they are our best estimates at the moment of the wider economic benefits, the productivity gains, etc. I would make a distinction between those wider economic benefits that are reported in the economic case and the KPMG report, which gives you these huge gains if you net present value them. And that's because I think that those KPMG estimates are very overstated. So I do take the numbers seriously. So sorry, to come then back to whether or not we should take the 1.8 credibly, my detailed involvement with HS2 Limited and the underlying analytical work they were doing around the BCRs ended, I think, 18 months ago, some period ago. At that point, I found that they had done a reasonable case in trying to assess those BCRs and those wider economic benefits that appear in the economic case reasonably carefully. It's harder for me to assess the variations that have happened since. I mean, the predominant issue seems to be we valued the business use down, so therefore let's increase the number of business users that we assume are going to do this, and the sort of cost benefit, those two sort of changes.
What you're saying, Professor Overman, sort of makes it sound as if it's just really a finger in the air. I mean, is it at all reliable? And particularly, is it at all reliable on a standalone basis? Is it not the case that it's only really useful if you're comparing 10 projects and you've got a BCR with wider economic benefits assessed on the same basis for each of those 3 or 5 or 10 projects? I mean, can this on a standalone basis be at all useful?
So let me answer the two parts of that question. I don't think it's just a finger in the air exercise. I don't think it should be the only thing that we are taking into account when we make decisions about investments. Because, otherwise there would be no need for you guys, and, you just get me ranking the BCRs and making a decision. But I think it's unfair to suggest that it's not picking up something real. It is our best estimates about what we think the relative benefits, the cost of this project would be, and of course they're hugely uncertain. Well, then they're uncertain, but I still think the central point estimates are informative. I do think how you use them is to make comparison to other projects. Now, the DFT guidance, when it classes things as poor, medium, etc., I understood to be doing that on the basis of the standard BCR. If you want to make the comparison on the basis of the BCR with the wider economic benefits included, and here I'm talking about those in the economic case, you should go back to the Eddington report. The Eddington report did try adding in those wider economic benefits. I had to say, I actually printed off this morning to see where it would stack up. Interurban corridors that Eddington looked at in 2006, the bottom 25%, it looks to me, had a BCR including wider economic benefits that would be about 2.5. So that places, so that does give you a feeling that BCR with the wider economic benefits in would put high-speed rail in about the bottom 25% of interurban corridors that we had, and it would be even lower if we looked at all of the types of schemes we had on the book, because I'm only telling you the interurban schemes there. So I think you're right, you shouldn't consider it in isolation, you should think about it as a portfolio of things, but I think you're wrong to suggest that we should just ignore the number, that there's no information content in it.
Okay. And Professor Graham, in terms of the argument for HS2, it's moved from one of speed to one of capacity and overcrowding. Is that a reasonable argument, bearing in mind that the West Coast Main Line isn't the most overcrowded line? And what about obviously you're there to answer the question about the benefit-cost ratio, but if one were simply looking at capacity and overcrowding, is again the central necessity to then look at where is the greatest problem with capacity and overcrowding, and why aren't we looking at a high-speed line to solve that problem first before this one?
It's just an easy question there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I won't answer that because I'm not an expert in capacity and overcrowding in the network. What I would like to say, just to add to Henry's point, is that benefit cost analysis has been established over several decades now. There's a strong theoretical basis for it, and over the decades we've built up empirical evidence which has been rigorously reviewed, both within government and by academics and through the peer review process. And that counts also for wider economic benefits, which are, if you like, one of the more recent additions to benefit cost. The thinking was there's something missing, can we measure them? Now, none of this is perfect, but we understand the assumptions behind it, we understand the theory, and the empirical evidence gets reviewed, and it's there. So it's perfectly clear. It's all there. We can all look at it. We can debate it. The problem with the KPMG approach is that approach hasn't got that history. It's not got that academic support. It's not got the theoretical support. And that's the difference. So when we talk about wider economic benefits and cost-benefit analysis, we're talking about something that's very specific that we've really thought about and that we've analysed and put up to public scrutiny. And I was heavily involved in that work. That's not the case with the report that we were discussing today.
Right. So what would be your advice to the government in order to get that accuracy? Is it possible to redo the report, to do a further report and do it on the proper statistical basis that you and Professor Overman have outlined?
Undoubtedly the work could be done better, yes. My advice to any government would be, if you want to think seriously about whether investments are worth making, you have to look at things like benefit cost, because we have to be analytical about it. The 15 billion to me may be true, but certainly nothing in that report indicates to me that it's true. So there isn't a scientific basis for it. And I think we could do a better job.
Okay, thank you.